What's up, viewer? Happy Saturday morning to you. Trying to get myself going this Saturday morning. Not a lot going on. I was just going over the news. Nothing major in the news. All that stuff about Canadian protests there. I think it's pretty incredible. I guess it's a peaceful protest, but it has pretty serious, economic impact to just shut down the major ways of travel. I don't know. It's an intense protest. What they said on the weeknight news is that there was some talk of those protests spreading to America, particularly around the Super Bowl and then heading to the Capitol. I don't know. I did read one article that people tried to do something kind of similar in New Zealand and they weren't having it. They just arrested people. Because when you think of a protest, you think of individual people, in a public space. I don't know what Canada's protesting laws are. I assume they have similar, rights to assemble and protest that we have here in America. But I don't know. A vehicle protest is kind of unprecedented. I don't know. I can't think of any other time where. I do know, at least in America, you can't protest in the streets. If your protest blocks the, freedom of travel of vehicles, then you get arrested. So I would imagine that, there's all kinds of legal grounds to start, again, I don't even know, why they allowed it to go on. It's been going on now for almost 2 weeks, I think, at least a week. It's I don't know if it's just because of the amount of people involved in the protests and they don't know how to really peacefully get people back away from the capital of Ottawa. I don't know. It's pretty intense though. But yeah, that was the major news. The Olympics going on. America's finally catching up in the Olympic medals, which is good. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, trying the streaming thing because it's like, I don't know. I mean, I think it's pretty therapeutic. I mean, I don't half the time. I mean, here's how my career's been going because I've done over like 4 or 5 hours in the past couple 2 or 3 days, and typically I'll get one viewer, and that viewer typically does not engage in chat. So I mean, it's cool if there's one person viewing. I mean, I don't have anything wrong with that, but I get suspicious kind of that it's like some kind of bot viewer, because I don't know. It just seems like pretty typically within the first 5 minutes I'll get one viewer pop up. I mean, my stream summary, sometimes it says it's a unique viewer, sometimes it says it's not. I mean, there are occasions where the viewer will chat, but it seems like a little bit suspicious. And again, so far, I mean, I twitched a little bit, or I streamed a little bit in the summertime, and I had a couple times. I think the most I ever had on at once was 7 people, but it didn't last very long. I mean, it went back down. I think a couple times I had like 2 or 3. I don't know. I mean, it's just. I mean, I've got a lot of free time on my hands. I mean, I have a mental health condition, mental illness that makes it difficult for me to, kind of engage in regular employment. So, I'm trying to do a little bit of DoorDash, and stuff like that. But, bottom line is like, I've got tons of time to do this streaming. But then, like, content, I don't know. I mean, I like to talk about current events and news and technology and science and philosophy, stuff like that. But like I said, I don't know. I mean, obviously the big time streamers, they usually have like, gaming content or, some kind of supplementary content that people, I don't think many people do very well on streaming just by stream of consciousness style talking. But I don't know. We'll see. I mean, I do play a couple video games. I mean, I'm not very good at them, but I've played World of Warcraft, since the late 2000s, and well, not continually, but it's when I first started playing. And I'm not very good. I can do PvP all right, but not like at a ranked level. I don't think I've ever totally leveled up a character. I usually do the low level PvP. And again, it's like, I don't think anybody would really want to watch that. I mean, I'm just not that good at it. And then the other big video game that I've put up quite a bit of hours into is Civ 5. Done a lot of Civ 5 play. I mean, that could be interesting, because it is, you get like, I mean, it's very, global in terms of like, the whole point of the game is to basically dominate the globe through culture, technology, or military means. And it might be interesting to comment on that. But those games are long. I mean, like, from beginning to end, a Civ game is like, 10, 20 hours of gameplay. So I think that would probably be more suited for like a YouTube channel where I could break up the gameplay. But even those games, I mean, those are the only 2 real video games I play, and I don't play them that often. I don't know. When I was younger, I played more, but I don't really play that much video games. I don't know. I mean, other content, I do like to watch movies. Doing like film review could be interesting. Maybe. I don't know. It's hard to tell what people would be interested in. I mean, usually as far as the topics, I try to, as I said, I've got the mental health condition, so, I'm pretty familiar with, like, what it's like to be somebody who's mentally ill, the different treatments, pharmaceuticals. I mean, obviously that's from a consumer side. I mean, I don't have, any education as far as, from a provider standpoint. But, and then as far as topics, I do have a college degree in business with a focus on accounting, but I also studied, quite a bit of economics, and I actually started as an engineering student, so I studied quite a bit of mathematics and physics. So sometimes I have opinions about that, but accounting is not very exciting. I mean, it's just basically the recording of business transactions, but there are some interesting things, like when you get into the conspiracy world of like the, banksters, the global banksters, control the economic fields, which, I mean, as far as banking as a practice, I mean, I always say that, we're very conditioned to, kind of, contemporary banking is, fiat debt. And what that means is that the money is not based on any kind of commodity or resource. It's strictly based on, legislative grace, particularly the ability for government, at least here in the United States, the ability for the federal government to collect income tax or other forms of taxes, but primarily income tax. And again, I mean, as a culture, I feel like most people think that that's just kind of the way it is. But, if you study the history of banking, even in America, but in the West and even in Asia, you'll find that, this form of fiat tax, income tax-based banking is, it's not the only form of currency. I mean, as I just said, there's obviously commodities and as a backing for currency, and a few people who follow finance, the whole cryptocurrency discussion is, could be interesting as far as a future of, a different form of currency. I mean, I think the way that they're handled now is sort of private assets. That's going to be difficult to really, I can't think of really a successful currency that didn't have integration into some sort of government at some level. But like I said, the idea of backing a currency to a digital commodity, like the mined bitcoins or that sort of technology, I think that does have some interesting applications as far as moving away from debt and income tax based currency and back towards a resource backed. I mean, one of the advantages of the digitally mined commodities is that you can calculate, or at least adjust. It's very predictable, and because obviously one of the major disadvantages of backing it to silver or gold is, you were sort of reliant on the, mining of those precious metals to, determine what the money supply would be. So you could find yourself in, the credit supply, it was largely, constricted or expanded based on how successful the mining operations were. And, and that's not really ideal because, ideally you want, some control over, the expansion and contraction of the money supply. And that's, the current theory of fiat currency is that, the independent central banks have the ability to more or less indirectly affect the contraction and expansion through the raising and lowering of interest rates. But again, it's still an indirect, it's not, they can't exactly determine what the money supply is going to be. It's still, there's a lot of market forces that come into play. And yes, predictably, if you raise the interest rates sufficiently, people are going to typically shy away from borrowing in that environment, whereas if you lower the interest rates, people are typically going to be more likely to borrow in that environment, which, just on a tangent, the majority of money that's created is through um, construction, particularly home construction and commercial construction and the mortgage industry. Um, but like I said, as an alternative, you could see how instead of relying on interest rates to determine, to try to affect the expansion or contraction of the money supply, if you could directly, determine what you're mining as far as the digital commodity, how much or how little of that digital commodity you wanted to mine, you could, in theory, perhaps have a much more direct impact on the money supply. But maybe some may argue that that's a dangerous thing to do because, they're obviously advocates of the free market suggest that, the collective market has a better ability to determine things like money supply and price level. And if you gave that ability instead of to the whole market into the hands of a few economists or digital commodity bankers, you could have negative consequences. I don't know. I mean, it's, as I said, I studied economics and finance and accounting, so I'm interested in it. I mean, obviously, as far as the current events, I mean, just a couple days ago, we recorded the highest CPI, Consumer Price Index, increase in 40 years. So, and I was looking at some global news, and that was pretty consistent across Western Europe as well. They also were recording similar record levels of inflation, consumer price index increase. So what that means is that, especially, because the independent Federal Reserve and central banking generally in the West, they typically operate under two mandates. The first of which is to try to create an environment for full employment or the greatest amount of employment as possible. And then their second mandate is to try to maintain inflation at a reasonable pace. And it doesn't necessarily, one doesn't necessarily come before the other. I mean, it's kind of a subjective discussion as to, which is more important. But regardless, most economic indicators are suggesting that the employment market is relatively strong. So that, what that means is that there's, not as much of a reason for the stimulus style banking or favorable credit conditions. And then obviously the inflation is indicating that something needs to be done to contract the money supply. So most people are suggesting that when they meet next month, there's going to be anywhere from a 25 basis point to a 50 basis point increase. And then, most people are also arguing that depending on how that affects the CPI and employment factors, there could be another 2 to 5 rate hikes by the end of the year. And the problem is that typically when these rate hikes happen, I mean, especially if the rate hikes are not what was predicted by the collective equity market and bond market, but even when they kind of know it's coming, typically throughout the history of the stock market in America post Federal Reserve, generally it results in some sort of sell-off or transition of assets from equity to bonds or even equity to cash. Not always, but I mean, that's, a big thing that in the 2008 crisis, I mean, we had, leading up to that, kind of similar levels of inflation. And again, I don't know. I mean, obviously, I think a big concern from where I'm looking at it is, so that's part of the stimulus is keeping the interest rates low. But another thing the Federal Reserve has been doing, which they initiated back in 2008, is something called quantitative easing, which is essentially where they buy mortgages or mortgage-backed securities. And, that's almost the more worrying thing is, like, if the Fed stops buying the 60 billion or so monthly purchases of mortgage-backed securities, it kind of comes to the question of what's the value of those securities on the open market. Is anybody gonna buy them? I mean, we could find ourselves in a similar type of crisis where nobody wants to buy these mortgages, and the mortgages are interwoven into a lot of derivative style contracts, collaborative debt obligations and such. So again, who knows it's very unpredictable, but I would say the raising of interest rates, it seems from what I'm reading, the market's trying to prepare for that environment. People are trying to, because obviously finance, the whole field of finance is about essentially predicting, forecasting revenues and expenses to forecast, earnings. But then once you forecast those earnings, the way you value, an equity is you discount those earnings over time based on the weighted average cost of capital. And the weighted average cost of capital is very much determined by, the overall interest market, as far as bond market and interest rates. So, it's like, even if the forecasts are similar with the higher interest rates, which in all honesty, they probably won't, because obviously if corporations aren't able to leverage through, cheap lending, typically that means they're not going to be able to grow their earnings at the same rate. So not only are the earning forecasts going to be lower, but then the way you discount those earnings is going to be, the valuations are going to be drastically lower because the interest rate environment is going to be higher. So that's essentially why you get into a situation when the interest rates rise of, the obvious things of, yes, corporations have a more difficult time borrowing and leveraging, their assets for growth, but then you also get in, and that affects earning potential, but then you also get into the discount factor of, now you have to discount the earnings at a higher rate, which, can, it does lead to a much lower valuation of the equity. And obviously if everybody collectively agrees that an equity is worth less, then it becomes sensible to sell that equity while it's above what you're valuing it at in terms of typical finance. But again, I think that's all pretty well understood. And, again, there's tons of financial, I don't know about tons, but, tens, hundreds of thousands of financial analysis who that's their job is to, predict those things. But there's not a lot of discussion, and it's a little bit, it's more of a niche area as far as, although mortgages are a very strong backbone of the economy, as far as like financial analysis, it's not usually a huge portion of a typical private investor. So again, I don't think it's as well understood. Not only that, but this method of interest rate discount and earnings forecasting, this has been, heavily seen and heavily thought about for at least 100 years. Whereas the whole idea of the government, particularly the Federal Reserve, buying, mortgage-backed securities, and that's only really been a thing that they've done since 2008, so about 14 years or 13 years. And I don't think it's very well understood as far as how that affects the overall economy. The basics are understood. Obviously, when they're buying mortgage-backed securities, they're putting money into the circulation, they're making it easier for private real estate ownership, so in theory, when they stop doing that, it's going to, constrict the money supply to a certain degree and, make it more difficult for private home loans or home ownership. But again, the exact technical, how much it's going to restrict. And then, as I said, the real problem of, so you've bought over the past 2 years, over $1 trillion worth of mortgages, who's going to buy those? Do they just sit on the Fed's balance sheet and does the Fed just manage them? Or do they try to sell those on the open market? and then again, I mean, what they valued them at, are they going to be able to sell them at anything close to what they bought them for? Again, and I don't know. I don't study it enough to know, but I think it could be. I mean, I think the worst case scenario is, if they open it up to the market to try to sell this over $1 trillion worth of private mortgages, and nobody wants to buy them, and they have to write off huge chunks of the value. And then the question is, what other instruments in finance are based on, incorporate those private mortgages into their, instrument, as far as, like, as I said, collateral debt obligations or various mortgage-backed securities. Because again, if the Fed owns a huge portion of the mortgage-backed securities, like $1 trillion, and all of a sudden they have to revalue that trillion at $500 billion, that has a ripple effect as to the value of all mortgage-backed securities, which could create a huge downward, crash, for lack of a better word, in the MBS market. Who knows? I don't know for sure. That's for sure. Again, I only have one viewer, so I don't know. I mean, as I said, I sometimes wonder, I mean, in the world of bots and everything, it's like I just had a whole conversation about Federal Reserve, and like, probably nobody watched it, but I don't know, one viewer here. What do you want to talk about? What's a good topic? I was reading, I was doing some research into the Russia issue. I mean, there's no doubt that, Putin, during his press conference with Macron, the president of France, he had some fiery language. And again, I guess there's like a translation deficit, because it wasn't until like Russian outlets, released the translation that people realized. I mean, again, he's just, he's basically suggesting, his point is that Article 5 of the NATO, treaty alliance which is basically the mutual defense article, makes it so that if anybody in the NATO member states are attacked, it's viewed as an attack on the entire alliance. So his point was that, like, if you included Ukraine in that, then you're opening up the door to, essentially world war. But he's also, he references like his nuclear stockhold, which I think is just a kind of dangerous rhetoric as far as, he like basically the context, I think, was like he admits that, like, hey, you might have stronger overall military power as NATO compared to Russia, but he's like, don't forget that we're nuclear, and if I don't know. He admits that that's not what he wants, but then I did some more research into because basically, most people remember Crimea, which is a peninsula on the south Black Sea, I think. But then there's an ongoing conflict since Crimea pretty much they took control of, and it wasn't really put up a fight. But then there's the Donbass region, which is basically just north of Korea in the southeast of Ukraine. And that's apparently been an ongoing conflict since 2014. And it's not like a direct Russian invasion style. I mean, they basically use like misinformation and cyber attacks, and then there's like Russian segregatists that are more or less independent from direct affiliation from the Russian government. But then I ended up stumbling my way onto an essay he wrote. And the thing you have to understand about Putin, and I guess this is maybe true for a lot of Russian people and Ukrainian people, is that I didn't finish the essay because I fell asleep, but he was basically making the point that the ancient Rus, or the people before they became Orthodox Christians, or the Polish became Catholic. I mean, their capital was Kiev. I mean, like, there was an ancient prince, Grand Prince or whatever, who converted to Orthodox Christianity. But I guess the point he was trying to make is that historically, all through the Tsar, all through the USSR, like, if you look at history of the ancient Rus and the Russian Federation and Ukraine, at least for Putin, he thinks that this artificial sort of segregation between Ukraine and Russia that is essentially only like 30, 40 years old, that's not really, doesn't really reflect the historical context of the fact that, throughout the rest of, the last millennia and even ancient history, these Ukrainians and Russians share a very similar, ethnic and historical background. And I guess I didn't really realize. I mean, I knew some about it. I mean, I knew, like the Tsarina Catherine, incorporated Ukraine as far as farming and such. But the essay was pretty interesting as far as the historical context of, at the very least, Putin's position is that, it's not a reasonable position to, view Ukraine as a separate, independent peoples from the Russian, and in essence, they're the same peoples, they're one peoples, as he says. And I mean, again, I obviously don't know. I mean, this is what he's saying, so I take it at face value. I mean, let's see, it is a Russian bot. Look at that. Hossein Barmart. Are you a bot, Hossein, or it seems like you are trying to get me to click on a sketchy website? Well, that looks like it came from YouTube. It doesn't say I have a YouTube. I'm just gonna ignore the. My point is that, the ancient Rus people, according to this essay by Putin, I mean, he argues that, separating the Ukrainian people from the Russian people is just like a divide and conquer tactic by the West, like where they want, Ukraine to feel like they're an independent peoples, just as a way to, fragment the people. And I mean, and one example of this is the Orthodox churches. I mean, and Orthodox Christianity is by far the majority of both Russia and Ukraine. But the Orthodox, so there's an Orthodox church in Russia, the Moscow Patriarch, and up until the last few years, that was the only Orthodox church. And, even though the Ukrainians were a separate state, they basically had the same church as Russia. But then I guess there was in the past few years an attempt to make like an independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and that's been very controversial. And I guess from what I read, the way Orthodoxy Christianity works is that it's not the same as Catholic, where it's all unified under a pope. Like each sort of the Greek and the Russian, and there's basically 14 uh, independent and verifiable or recognized orthodoxies, and they all have their own kind of leadership, but they recognize each other, and they share similar kind of beliefs. But anyway, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, or the one that was created as an independent, is not fully recognized. I mean, they're only recognized by four of the other Orthodox branches. So that's another type of thing that I think somebody like Putin would feel like is a ridiculous position to take. But I mean, again, I don't. From my perspective as an American, I feel like, again, I don't really, for example, I live in New England, so, New England is a region of America where we do share a lot of historical and cultural similarities. But then there are six or seven states within the region that are each independent. So it's like, I mean, I could definitely see how if some foreign power tried to separate my state and say, well, you're no longer part of New England, and you have to be an independent peoples, to the detriment of New England. Yeah, I could see how that I'd be frustrated by that. I mean, I'd be like, well, it doesn't make a lot of sense economically or politically or even culturally. But I think from, if you read, just American media outlets, they like to paint a picture of Ukraine as like this independent, nation that, they seem to imply that it's like always been an independent nation, and that, like for example, when it was included as a Soviet republic, that was like a oppressive position of the Soviet Republic. But what I'm reading in the Russian outlets, particularly in this essay by Putin himself, he's making the argument that that's, that Ukraine historically has always really been a part of the ancient Rus people, and that in fact, the ancient Rus used to have their capital in Ukraine, or at least in Kiev, and that this whole idea of Ukraine being, an independent, nation is a new phenomenon, based on the, fallout from, Gorbachev, or anyway, the fall of the USSR. Which again, before I looked into it, I didn't really know. I mean, I had heard some things about Ukraine being involved, but I certainly didn't understand that as far as the Rus Slavic people, they, the Rus, they, used to center their governmental forces around Kiev, and I don't know. I mean, the bottom line is that, again, it just gets into politics of, right now the Ukrainian premier, or prime minister, or president is like an actor. So it's like, nothing against actors. I mean, obviously one of the most famous presidents in modern American time, Reagan, was an actor. But, I don't know. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is that, it's like anything. I think there's information campaigns on both sides, both from the West and NATO allies, and from the Russian people. Obviously, the Russian campaign is trying to, you know, have an acknowledgement of the historical relationship between the ancient Rus and, you know, the context where, you know, there wasn't really a border between Russia and Ukraine the way there is now. And then the Western propaganda or campaign is mostly trying to encourage this idea that, you know, Russia is an autocratic state, and, you know, you want the values of democracy and free markets. And I'm sure it's very confusing as far as being in Ukraine to try to sift through, you know, what the appropriate position to take is, because, you know, again, I mean, even though it's historically a new phenomenon for Ukraine, according to what this essay said by Putin, for Ukraine to be considered an independent state from the Rus, it's still, even though historically new, it's still 40 years. So that means, you know, there's an entire couple generations that's all they've known, you know, and obviously that's the up and coming generation, and democratically they probably have a lot of voting power to, you know, elect leaders either for or against this type of position. So, you know, I'm sure it's very confusing for people who are, you know, born in the millennial generation like me to try to sift through, you know, what is the appropriate position to take. I mean, you know, because again, all they've known is that they're, you know, an independent country, and then obviously the people above that, I mean, they, you know, as far as the older generation, you know, they were, you know, part of a Soviet republic, and, you know, might have their own feelings about the success or failure of Soviet political economic activities. So I don't know. But definitely hearing Putin sort of flippantly suggest that, you know, his nuclear power is more modern than the West is, you know, it's a little concerning. I mean, I would say that it's certainly, you know, it's not what you want to hear from a nuclear leader to, you know, basically imply that if things really came to it, he's willing to use nuclear force to, you know, impose his will or protect his borders or whatever it is he thinks he's doing. I mean, it'd be awesome to get the streaming thing to the point where there's like actual conversation going on. And I feel kind of stupid talking to myself to. And again, the evidence, like I said, here the only comment is on what looks to be a Russian bot trying to encourage me to go to some kind of, God only knows what that website would lead to. No way in hell I'm going to click on it.